Guitar Co-op Podcasts. Great composers. Conceived and presented by Fabio Zanon. One of the most moving scenes in the movies takes place in the film On the Waterfront by Elia Kazan. Marlon Brando gives a lifetime performance playing the role of a failed ex-boxer who works as Steve in the port of New York. In the middle of the film, there is a scene when he accuses his brother of disloyalty and says, "You don't understand. I could have had class. I could have been a contender. I could have been someone instead of this bum, which is what I am. Let's face it." When I see the scene, for some reason, I think of the greatest guitar composer of the early 19th century, Fernando Sor, the reluctant guitarist. Just listen to this letter Fernando Sor wrote in 1830. "You have to live," they told me when I arrived in France. "Compose easy arias." A very renowned guitarist told me that he had been forced to give up writing like me because publishers had openly said it's one thing to appreciate music as a connoisseur and another thing to sell music. I like your work, but I wouldn't recoup my production costs. What can I do? I have to live. If Fernando Sor has managed to write music of this kind in this hostile environment, I can only imagine how much exceptional music he would have written if a more favorable commercial environment had existed. He belongs to what some today call the golden age in the history of the guitar. In fact, this golden age didn't last for 30 years and forced very capable people like Fernando Sor to publish what they didn't want to publish, to cater to an audience that had a very trivial taste. That happened between the end of the Napoleonic era and the revolutions in 1830. For us guitarists, the name Fernando Sor commands respect and divides opinions at once. Some continue to repeat the caption Beethoven of the guitar and consider his works to be the pinnacle of guitar repertoire. Others find his music predictable and trivial and detest him precisely because he's not Mozart or Beethoven. Sor, in fact, belongs to that class of composers that is pretty much everybody else who are not as good as Mozart and Beethoven. But he was already seeking another path and navigated a bit according to the reception of his works outside of the guitar world. I think the most fascinating thing about his music was defined by guitarist and guitar maker Sérgio Abreu. He already adopts an almost romantic expression within a classical formal framework. This presents the interpreter with a challenge: how to find a lively interpretation that does not lean too much to one side or the other. This perfect middle ground is exactly what we find in Sérgio's interpretations, both as a soloist and as a member of the Abreu Brothers duo. Guitar Co-op is very happy to have released the remastering of the historic album on which the Abreu duo plays the theme with variations L'Encouragement by Fernando Sor. If we consider that Sor is one of the 3 or 4 most important composers in guitar history, it's bizarre to think that we had very little knowledge of his work until very recently. And worse, few people who play his music have any idea of his biography and his completely original ideas about how to play the guitar. A complete edition of his works only appeared in the 1980s and a biography in 1994. Until then, his works were usually played in fragments, filtered by unreliable editions. And yet, we have to be grateful to these editions because without them, he wouldn't have been played at all. Sor is the composer who accompanies every serious guitarist from the first lessons until a professional career, because he has written music for all levels. Since the 1990s, musicology has made incredible discoveries about Sor, especially through the incredible work of Brian Jeffrey and Erik Stenstadvold. Fernando, or Ferran Sor, was born in Barcelona in 1776. His family had wealth and social standing. It was a family with a military tradition, and he was destined to follow in their footsteps until his father introduced him to Italian opera. From then on, he lost interest in a military career and turned his interest to music, which his family tried to prevent. Age 11 or 12, his talent was already recognized. When his father died, around that time, the monks in the monastery of Montserrat, who had already heard of his qualities, offered him a scholarship to study as a chorister. When his mother realized that he was increasingly moving away from a military career, she took him out of the monastery and enrolled him in a military school. This was not a big deal because there he had plenty of time to compose music as well. This traditional monastic education made all the difference in Sor's guitar music. It is what sets him apart from other Viennese or Italian composers from the same period, because he was versed in scholastic counterpoint, which was the basis of sacred music. His guitar music is written in polyphonic form. That is to say, he writes for the guitar as if he were writing for a choir, in 3 clearly designed parts and with the correct voice leading. This creates fingering difficulties that no other work of the period has, but greatly increases the artistic quality of his works. In 1808, Napoleon invaded Spain. Sor was already in the army. He was promoted to captain and sent to Córdoba. It is quite possible that he fought in battle against the French. For us, all that remains are patriotic songs, and we know that he played in military bands. With the defeat of Spain, Sor accepted an administrative post in the oppressive government. He was officially considered the Frenchman for having decided to abandon the defense of Spain in favor of the ideals of the French Revolution. When the Spanish expelled the French in 1813, his position became untenable and he fled to Paris, never to return to Spain. He was 35 years old. we had to try to understand what kind of person Fernando Sor was. Was he simply a cowardly betrayer to the fatherland, or was there some other issue behind it? On the one hand, of course, there is the alternative, the restoration to power of Ferdinand VII, known as the Criminal King. He is considered by many the worst monarch in history of Spain, who tore up the liberal constitution, suppressed freedom of the press, lost all the colonies in America, and threw the country into a civil war after his death. On the other, Fernando Sor was a Catalan of French descent. In the monastery of Montserrat, he was imbued with the ideals of the French rationalism. His work reflects his political and intellectual position, which is quite progressive and refined. His greatest educational work, The Method for Guitar, insists that in writing a method, I am speaking only of that method which my reflections and my experience have made me establish myself in order to govern my playing. Music, reasoning, and the preference which I generally give to results over the appearance of difficulty, that is all my secret. Against reason, he says, stands authority. I'm not a citizen of authority. You should not accept something just because mio maestro faceva così, which he quotes in Italian, because my teacher used to play like that. Rather, you should use reason to discover for yourself what the true principles are, which underlie what you are examining. These are the words of a son of the Enlightenment. Sor also said that blind submission on the part of reason degrades the human spirit. When he was 30, his patriotic songs showed a concern for freedom, such as Vivir en cadenas, que triste vivir. That means to live in chains, what a sad life. Another song is called Le Dernier Cri des Grecs, The Last Cry of the Greeks, composed in 1828 to support the Greeks during the Turkish invasion. And recently, an incredible work has resurfaced, a song called Appel des Nègres, The Appeal of the Black People, a song that advocates the abolition of black slavery. In other words, Sor defended above all the modern concept of human rights. And this is associated with his rationalist view of composition and the study of instrumental technique. You, a guitar student, before complaining about having to learn Sor studies, remember that you are playing music by someone concerned with freedom and equal rights. In Paris, Sor quickly became a prominent guitarist. However, when he tried to present his operas, he was unsuccessful. The first works he published in France alternate collections of relatively easy pieces with works of almost unsurmountable difficulty, which few others than himself would be able to play. The most extravagant and also one of the best is the Fantasia Opus 7. It's a monumental theme with variations written on 2 staves like a piano and 3 different clefs. have to remember that for half of his life, Sor had refugee status. At times, the French government tried to expel the Spanish community that was living in France, realizing that he did not have the opportunities he felt he deserved, including because of his unstable immigrant status. In 1815, Sor moved to London, quickly again establishing himself as a guitarist and teacher. Realizing that the English like ballet more than opera, he tried his hand at this new genre and composed the ballet Cendrillon, which was a huge success. When it seemed that he was finally achieving the recognition he wanted, he decided to move again in 1823. Recent research has tried to review the reason for this new phase in his life, and the findings are somewhat creepy. Until very recently, little was known about Sor's new girlfriend, the French ballerina Félicité. She came from a family of dancers and was already recognized for her style in London when she was still a child. It was believed that Sor had first gone to Paris, then to Russia, enchanted by her. This is partly true. Sor was already 45 and Félicité was only 17. Yes, she went to Paris for reasons of trying to advance her career, but so did Sor. He wanted to capitalize on the success of the ballet Cendrillon and present that in Paris. And he did. And there is another question. Recent documents indicate that Sor was forced to leave England for having impregnated a woman outside of marriage, which was illegal at the time and could have landed him in prison. Maybe Félicité was pregnant, and we know that Sor had children. Or was he leading a double life, maybe having children with one woman while starting a relationship with another? In any case, it seems that they got married in Paris, for in his letters he refers to her as my little wife, and she starts citing herself as Madame Sor. Soon after, an invitation to work in Moscow appears. This is an area of their biography that has only recently begun to be studied in more depth. Félicité finally obtains a position as prima ballerina. Sor, contrary to popular belief, did not work only as her accompanist. Apparently he also obtained a job. The Petrovsky Theatre in St. Petersburg, better known to us as the Bolshoi, opened up in 1825 exactly with a production of Cendrillon by Fernando Sor, an unparalleled distinction. By 1827, they had gained enough prestige to take 5 months paid leave from their work in St. Petersburg to travel to Paris. In Russia, in addition to Cendrillon, Sor had managed to premiere 2 other great ballets, Hercule d'Enfant, which premiered at the coronation of Tsar Nicholas, and Alphonse et Léonore. Félicité appears as a choreographer and prima ballerina in both productions. It must be remembered that the French ballets at the time were, as far as composition goes, a big mess. Ballet composers in general were less professional than opera composers. In an attempt to improve the quality of the music, original music was mixed up with arrangements of music by, say, Mozart and other famous composers, which was perfectly acceptable during a time when copyright was not yet legally established. Fernando Sor broke this pattern by composing 100% of the music for his ballets and maintaining a consistent quality in his composition. This 5-month leave in Paris seems to have been disastrous for their personal lives and is still awaiting documentary confirmation. At the end of the season, Félicité returned to Russia alone and Sor remained in Paris for the rest of his life. We still have to study Félicité's entire career in more detail. Since she was in the shadow of an important name like Fernando Sor, she appears as a somewhat secondary character, which is totally unfair. She lived in Russia until the end of her life. She worked as a ballerina, choreographer, and teacher. It seems that she was an important artist in the establishment of the brilliant Russian school of ballet, which is not a small feat. But, as it often happens in these cases of contentious separation, she suffered an erasure. Sor himself made a point of erasing his name from any mention of her, and she's also erased from his early biographies. This return to Paris marked Sor's downfall. He was already 6 years old, and the star of the guitar in France had faded. The new bourgeois society had other interests, above all, especially opera and the recently invented grand piano. Sor continued to publish music, but here we perceive an exacerbated bitterness. His habit of complaining and moaning and making caustic comments in public must not have helped much in the reception of his new works. One of the best pieces of this period, his Opus 45, is called Mes Ennuis, that is, My Displeasures. Look at what this unfortunate man writes in the preface, dedicated to whoever wants it. Let's see if that's that. 6 short and easy pieces in stages which aim to lead to what has generally been agreed are difficulties. Composed and dedicated to the person with the least patience by Fernando Sor. During these years of decline, his last major work was a mass in honor of his daughter, who died in 1837. A work for the guitar from this period, the Fantasia elegiaque, Opus 59, was written in honor of the death of a student and friend. The death of his daughter led Sor to a serious depression, and he died due to tongue and throat cancer in 1839. Sor's oeuvre has not yet been properly dated. All of his works were first published in Paris or London after he moved to Paris in 1813. Almost all of his guitar works are numbered with an opus number, from 1 to 61 or so works. Up until Opus 22, a large sonata more or less, we can be certain that these works that he had already written in Spain in his youth before moving to Paris. A letter he wrote from Russia shows that some important works, such as the Fantasia Opus 30, were written there. But he also shows an awareness that publishers back in France were publishing music that was not yet finished without his authorization, which explained the somewhat shabby state of some of them. Here, we can already define the typology of Sor's works. First of all, some of his best works are short, one-page pieces of music compiled in collections such as Opus No. 1 and Opus No. 5. He tries to keep the difficulty under control, but does not skimp on artistic quality. One of the most beautiful is the famous Andante Largo Opus 5 No. 5. Some time ago, I wrote a text about Sor saying that within this formal framework inherited from classicism, he already had a romantic sensibility that even reminded me of Mendelssohn's music. But Mendelssohn was born in 1809. He was 4 or 5 years old when Sor published his music that was already composed before it. In fact, we need to reclaim Fernando Sor's position within this gradual change in sensitivity and conditions of artistic production that define what we now call Romanticism. He's part of this group of composers like Rossini, Paganini, Hummel, Schubert, Gossec, who made the transition to this new musical era. Sor has a set of fantastic educational works. At this time, the Etudes Opus 6 and Opus 29 are the greatest technical challenges of any composer. At the same time, they are uncompromising works without easy and showy virtuosity. Along with Paganini, Czerny, and a little later Chopin, he inaugurates the idea of technical study as music of artistic value, which can be played in concert. During his second residence in Paris, he first of all writes a portentous guitar method where he explains objectively and succinctly, using his knowledge of anatomy and geometry, how each student can rationalize his technique and posture. It remains one of the best texts on guitar technique and interpretation ever written, and proves that Sor's style as a performer was clearly much more imaginative, bolder, and more colorful than what is normally practiced today, a kind of a posteriori construct. The works of the Second Parisian Sojourn are aimed at less advanced students and amateurs, and Sor wrote 3 collections of studies, Opus 31, 35, and 60, which are the highest level study material ever reached in the history of guitar. The other most frequent genre in Sor's work is the Fantasia. This kind of fantasy has nothing to do with Dowland's fantasies that we heard in the previous episode. The most common type of Fantasia in Sor is an extensive piece in the form of theme variations, preceded by a somewhat mysterious introduction and finished with a brilliant finale. I have already mentioned the monumental Opus 7 and the Fantasie Elegiaque, but there is, for example, this Opus 16, which is an excellent and very little played piece. My favorite is Opus 30, which betrays the study that Sor must have made of Mozart's work. Some of the variations seem clearly inspired by Mozart's Serenade for Winds in C minor. This work was probably written in Russia and led a critic from Paris to note that Fernando Sor is a sublime musician who, however, chooses themes that are too trivial for his works. This theme, in fact, has both a humorous vein and a military background, which makes its interpretation especially complicated. Here we understand why Félicité nicknamed Sor the Beethoven of the guitar. These works are mixed up with other simply called themes and variations, where the introduction and finale are shorter. By far the best known and one of the most popular works by Sor is the Opus 9, Variations on a Theme from Mozart's Magic Flute. Not only is the composition technically perfect, but it also manages to maintain an infallible storytelling rhythm, one of the greatest moments in the guitar repertoire. Today, we tend to think of the sonata as the most elevated musical genre of this period, but most guitarist composers practice that only reluctantly. Sor left 4 works under this name, 2 of which, Opus number 15 and the Grand Solo, Opus 14, have only one movement. The Grand Solo shows Sor's military streak with a sustained war rhythm from beginning to end. The two great sonatas in multiple movements, Opus 22 and Opus 25, are both somewhat disappointing formally, but also contain some of the finest moments of Sor's music. The Grand Sonata Opus 25, almost 25 minutes of music, seems to be a compilation of scatter and unrelated movements made by Sor's publisher Meissonier in Paris. This explains its formal weakness. There are 4 movements in C major and C minors, ending with a minuet that doesn't provide a very convincing ending. But despite this, each movement is a jewel, and perhaps a performer who takes the liberty of rearranging these movements might produce a work of great value. Sor's duets are spectacular. At that time, guitar duos were mostly composed to be played by teacher and student duos, with one part much easier than the other. Fernando Sor played frequently with his friend the great Spanish virtuoso Dionisio Aguado, and this way he managed to write works that have more balancing between the parts. GuitarCoop is fortunate to have in its catalog one of the greatest guitar recordings of all time, the Abreu brothers playing theme and variations from the L'Encouragement Opus 34. Sor, as a songwriter, is often overlooked. He wrote in several genres while still in Spain, and in addition to the patriotic and libertarian songs already mentioned, he left a number of excellent, humorous songs. That reminds us that before being a musician of the international classicism, Sor is also a clearly Spanish composer.
Las mujeres y cuerdas de la guitarra, de la guitarra, de la guitarra. Es menester talento para templarlas, para templarlas. Es menester talento para templarlas, para templarlas.
He also left a number of excellent arias in Italian. I hope this episode has helped you, who comes from the guitar, to have a better understanding and knowledge of Fernando Sor's music, and if you don't, to get to meet a fantastic, fascinating composer-guitarist. I bid you farewell with a beautiful choral work by Sor, O Crux, reminding us that every guitarist has an artistic debt to Sor and should every now and again light a candle for him. we have prepared for you a beautiful playlist containing all the music that we have presented in this episode. So follow GuitarCoop channels to get more content about the guitar and listen to our playlist. Next episode, we'll talk about a very dear composer, Johann Sebastian Bach. Until then, see you there. GuitarCoop Podcasts. Great composers. Conceived and presented by Fabio Zanon.